And I also don't know who else coming. Maybe I should have had an RSVP. All right, let's get started. If anybody else wanders in, they wander in. I know there's some people that are sick or have sick spouses. Clerk, will you read the notice of the meeting? Oh, first you got to do roll call. Sorry. Will you do roll call, please?
Carter, Cowart, Esri, Furtado,
Here.
Goss, Hanauer Friedman,
Here.
Harper, Ingram,
Here.
Locke,
Here.
Lakshin, Michaels, Rodriguez, Rogers,
Here.
Sexton, Storr,
Present.
Straub, Taylor,
Here.
Thorsland,
Here.
Vanich Theranot, Williams, Wilson,
Here.
Patterson.
Thank you. Approval of the agenda. Wait, I have a question. Can we approve the agenda if we don't have, I don't think we have quorum. Does it matter? Okay. Okay, great. Can I have for approval of the agenda? Thorsland, second. Taylor. All those in favor?
There's going to be no discussion on the agenda.
No discussion on the agenda.
Okay, fine. Yes, aye.
I don't think you're allowed to have, are you? Yeah. All right, and sorry, too bad. Moving on. Public participation. I don't see any public going once, going twice. Okay. Communications from the board. All right, seeing none. All right, so basically what we're going to do, I'm going to go over to that computer so I could move the presentation. But we're just going to go through some basics of county board finance. It's going to be riveting. Appreciate it. Oh, thanks. So the goal of this is just to give like an overview, right? We're not going to get too much in the nitty gritty. We do have Tammy here to help answer questions for about 45 minutes, 40 minutes? Okay, for about an hour. So if you got questions, front load those questions. And we're just going to go ahead and get started. And please just, feel free to raise your hand or whatever if you got a question. So first of all, I want to say a big thank you to Megan and to Tammy and to Michelle, who's not here, who basically helped put this presentation together. Like, we met and had a discussion, and then they did all the work, which is awesome. So thanks to the admin team for doing that. So the first thing is, I think it's important for us to sort of have a sense of the departments. So you could kind of see the different departments that are that exist in and how the structure works. So you could see that there's, the different elected officials, the administrative services is under county executive, but then there's a lot of other boards, some of which now some of you all are appointed to, right? So everything from mental health to RPC, the Regional Planning Commission, to the Veterans Assistance Commission, the Board of Review. So this hopefully, and you can see there's sort of broken down, like gold is the justice system, green are folks that have something to do with real estate taxes, blue is admin, right? But this is a good sense, like, I think this is always, I always say, like, if you want to understand an organization, like, look at their org chart. And then just as a hint, you could go in the budget book, which is online. You could go and get the budget online, and each department, you could look at their org chart for each department, and it actually has the FTEs on there that they have under the different categories. So if you want to know more, I really recommend that you do that. Just so you know, the first thing I want to do is kind of give an overview of the budget. So we have 5 budget goals, and this is, I think, really important for us to keep in mind when we're doing the budget. First, that we have a high-performing, open, and transparent budget. And that's partially why we have, it might seem like in a minute I'm going to give you the calendar of budget meetings, like why there's 100 budget meetings, it feels like. In part, that's in order to enable the public to have a lot of opportunity to give feedback. That we would have safe and just communities, high quality public facilities and highways, and a safe rural transportation system and infrastructure, planned growth to balance economic growth with preservation of our natural resources, and the ability to maintain safe and accurate county records and perform county administrative governance, election, and taxing functions for county residents. So when we're making budget decisions, I think it's always a good idea to kind of go back to these. And you'll see on your desk, Megan gave us a more expanded version of these budget goals, and then sort of what we've been doing to accomplish those in the recent past, right? Okay, so when is the budget process? Always. We're always in the budget process. So first of all, this is just the calendar of meetings. I have mine on my refrigerator. You'll see we are on that January little black square. Those meetings are optional, and that's when, if we have an opportunity, if we want to dive deeper into a subject like that we don't think we're going to have time for at a board meeting, then we use these meetings as an optional meeting. I want to point out 3 things. In July, you'll see really the only meetings that there are the county board. The only meeting is the county board meeting. We don't have all the other ones. And then for the budget purposes, the 2 really important meetings, and I'm going to show you this in a different way in a second, are on August 28th and 29th is when we go through the budget in a very detailed manner. And then September 28th is 26th, right? Is the special budget, is 20th, I was right the first time, is the special finance meeting where it's really should be, for all intents and purposes, the last time for the board to weigh in on major budgetary decisions. So here is a more detailed calendar of the budget process. So what'll happen in April, is that right, Tammy, when you're going to come give Tammy will come and give us a financial forecast where she'll go through all the different funds and say, hey, this looks like it's doing this, you know, our revenue and expenditures change from year to year because sometimes for forces that are out of our hands, the state made this decision, you know, and she'll kind of walk us through that. And then in May, the county executive will come and give us a general overview of the direction he's seeing the budget. This is very, very high level, right? Very, very high level. And then basically they go away from us and through the summer work with the different departments working out their budgets. And then in August, we get the budget books, usually about a week, few days before the budget hearings. And this is an opportunity where the different elected officials or department heads will come if you've got questions. We try to keep those questions focused on the budget, although sometimes we stray into operations. Those are, especially the first night is usually a pretty long meeting. The second one is usually shorter. But we kind of this is where if you have specific questions about their budget, that's the opportunity to ask those. Then in September, the executive gives the board an overview of the budget, where it's standing. And then in September is, and it should be the 28th. I think we have it on there on the 29th. But, oh, last year. That's why. In September, then, we will have the meeting where so for example, if you were here at the last meeting, we discussed potentially looking at how we pay the juries, right? If that's something we want to do, that at some point during this, we need to give the direction to the executives team that that's indeed what we want to do. And I would say the last time that it's fair to the admin staff to make a big decision like that would be at that September meeting. Because if we let them get too far down the road, loading in one set of numbers, right? And at the last minute are like, by the way, we've made $1 million change of mind. You know what I mean? Like, it's good if we know as a board that we have a certain set of expectations, the earlier that we could signal that, the better, if that makes sense. Yes. No, it's a calendar. We have a calendar fiscal year. Yeah. Unlike the University of Insanity. Yes. We have a fiscal, our fiscal year is a calendar year. Right? Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just confirming that the fiscal year is indeed the calendar year and not the July 1st start.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It is. And then we vote on the budget a bunch. So then we get the tentative budget in October at the committee of the whole. We basically vote to put it on file. The public has a chance to weigh in. We then vote to take it and send it to the full board. And then in the full board in November is the final vote. So there's multiple opportunities for the board to weigh in, and there's multiple votes that we take on it. So when people say to me, oh, is there a meeting I really shouldn't meet that has to do with the budget? I'm like, yes, there's like 7, right? Does anybody have any questions about that process? And there have been times when the board has weighed in early in the process. So for example, one year the board weighed it, the nursing home is a big example. We had to make that decision early on during the budget process. One year we signaled that we really expected there to be some investment in election equipment because our election equipment had gotten very old and clankety and wasn't working anymore. And we just wanted to let the admin know that that was an expectation we had. Some year, the ARP, one year we spent, I don't know, a couple hours in this room hammering out our American Rescue Plan Act expectations by category, not so much by project, but like we wanted to put this much into water, or this much into infrastructure, broadband infrastructure. But I'll be honest, last year we had no major decisions left to make, and we canceled that September meeting because there was nothing big that the board had weighing on their minds, right? One year, you know, we had to decide if we were going to give the sheriff more deputies. I think he asked for 4. We ended up giving him 2, right? Yeah.
The budget direction for May that says county executive, just to note that historically, before the past administration, was the place where the county administrator would engage with the board to determine what their priorities were. And that's really that front end information that admin needs before we meet with all of the departments. Because at the point where we've met with all of the departments and the budget's formulated, if we haven't captured what the board's priorities are, it's very challenging to do so because we're trying to balance the budget.
And I'll just even be more pointed. The first year of the prior administration, we did do that. My sense is that the executive didn't care for the board's feedback. And then after that, the next 3 years, it was just a memo from her to us with no interaction. And I have talked to the new executive, and I believe we're going to go back to the old system where it's more of a conversation. Because as Tammy said, if y'all have something that you really want to see in the budget or direction you want to go, the earlier we could give it that sentiment, right, is the better. Because as the budget gets built out, it gets more and more complicated to have a sharp turn of direction, especially if it's financially significant, right?
And just to add to that, I know the statute says that the county executive is responsible for preparing the budget, but the county board approves it.
Right.
So it needs to be a collaborative process.
Correct. All right, so the first time that you could really weigh in is May, and then they kind of go away for a while they take what we've said and put it onto paper. And then the next time that you can weigh in substantially is in August when we have the hearings, and then September, right? So just to kind of have that on your radar screen. So what's required of the budget? The county board has to, approve a budget every year. It has to be open for public inspection for at least 15 days. This is important. It's a simple majority vote. So it's a simple majority vote on the budget. The budget has to be a one-year budget. Basically, the appropriations end at the end of that year. And then this is also very important. To amend the budget after it is passed requires a 2/3 majority vote, right? And that doesn't matter how you amend it. So if you get more revenue than you expected in a category, if you get a grant you didn't anticipate and budget for, it doesn't matter if that grant's $1. We have to take a vote, right, in order to amend the budget, and we'll get more into that later. The budget must be balanced. The county, and I've heard public comments from some folks that were running for office last time about the budget not being balanced. The county budget is balanced. Now, it's important to note that this is not your personal home checkbook, though. There's a lot of funds in there. It's complicated. So sometimes revenue will be received in one year and expended in another. Let me give you some examples. Highway is probably one of the biggest examples of this. A lot of times we'll get highway grants, and the projects, for various reasons, and this is not unique to Illinois, it was the same when I was in Indiana, get delayed, right? You get the money for the bridge project, you believe with your heart and soul the bridge project's happening in 2022, and because it's a joint project with the state, it doesn't happen to 2024, right? So the money's there, but it's not going to show up as revenue, right? So if all you do is look at the bottom line of the budget, it might look like, oh, they're overspending their budget. No, the money's there. It's just it was received a different year. Last year we got another $20 million in ARPA money that we're going to expend this year and into 2024 into 2026. There's a lot of special revenue funds. So like departments have their automation funds, and sometimes what they'll have to do is let that money build up in order to do a project from it, because they don't get a lot of money in a particular year. And so again, it isn't, or in what was kind of a wild situation, our fund balance was so healthy in 2022 that we were able to take $3.7 million and put it to our capital asset replacement fund in order to help facilitate both the move to the jail and the move to County Plaza. Again, so those revenues were not received in 2022, they were expended in 2022. But that doesn't make the budget unbalanced, right? It just means that sometimes you save up money and then use it to spend it on a project. Does that make sense? Okay. Balance between, so here's the rub. The elected officials and the appointed, the department heads, they always want more employees. We've given 7 new additional employees over the last year. Higher wages, newer equipment, more programs. And there is also this sentiment of like, oh no, it's budgeted, we got to spend it or we're going to lose it. Mike can attest to this, right? And almost in every case, their request is logical, right? I've now heard from 2 different sheriffs from 2 different political parties that they need more deputies. I'm not disagreeing that they need more deputies. The question is, do we have the money for the more deputies, right? And so we as a board have to weigh what are the needs and how can we do that with the money that we have, right? And that sometimes is really difficult. All right, so where does the money come from? We get money from sales taxes, a 1/4 cent sales tax, a 1/4 cent public safety sales tax, income tax, corporate personal property replacement tax, which is basically in the 1970 Constitution of Illinois. It doesn't allow local governments anymore to tax the property of corporations. And so in replacement of that, corporations have to pay a certain amount of money to the state that then allocates it back out to us. It's the easiest way that I can. Yes, after they take a big old cut of it, that sometimes changes. And then some smaller ones, an auto rental tax, a hotel. Is there like one hotel that we get? Yeah, there's one hotel in the whole county that we get a tax from that's in an unincorporated area. Use tax, this is, the best way that I could describe this is if you buy something out of the county or out of the state and there isn't tax, the seller doesn't tax you, then you're supposed to pay a use tax instead, right? So if you buy a car in Indiana and the dealership doesn't charge you taxes, theoretically you're supposed to pay this use tax, right? Instead, and then the motor fuel tax. And this is sort of a chart that shows where our money comes from. So property taxes is our biggest pot of money. Well, I guess it's our second biggest. Grants and revenue, a lot of that goes to RPC, but not all. We do get grants to the county itself. Intergovernmental revenue is all the money that the state collects on our behalf and then gives to us, and or there's certain things that they help us fund, right? So fees, fines, and charges, licenses and permits, miscellaneous revenue. I'll have an example of that later. And then interfund revenue. Tammy, would you like to just explain interfund revenue?
Yeah, we have some funds that bill other funds for services that they provide. We also have some operational funds that, for instance, self-funded insurance that basically pays for all of the bills, and then at the end of the year we do an allocation to determine what that cost distribution is to other funds. That's an example.
So just so you get a sense of like where our funds come from.
And I'll just add that, you know, one of the things that is important is that you have a diversification of your revenues. So, and this is, of course, across the entire county, so not just the general fund. But that 27, 24, 26% is a really nice balance of revenues. We're not, so, you know, if during COVID, you know, if sales tax and income taxes dipped, if you were largely relying on those things as your main revenue source, you're in trouble. Or, you know, vice versa with property taxes, if there's an, you know, an impact to market values of homes or CPI.
Right. Jeff?
Is this typical of all counties, of the 102 counties we have, or is it unique for our county? One, how we manage the budget, keeping it balanced, and two, the distribution of revenue.
I can't really speak if it's typical of all counties. You know, it would depend on the makeup of the county, you know, whether the county has like in an unincorporated area, whether they have like a mall. I mean, I can't speak to that exactly. What was the second question? How they, counties and how they balance their budgets. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, every county is really required to balance their budget. And for the most part, I would say, yes, largely counties are drawing on fund balances that they have built up over time for certain projects. So, you know, they may be operating that same way that we are, I would suppose. This is the only county I've ever worked for.
Here's just another way to look at it, revenue by fund type. So it's also really important. Okay, so as a board, sometimes you see this budget, and what was our total budget last year? Like 130?
187,000 million.
Yeah,
sorry.
so you look at it and you're like, whoa, that's a lot of money for us to think about. And it is to some degree, but a lot of the money that we get is either special revenue fund money that is for a very specific thing, or fees and fines that have to go to a specific, very, very specific expenditure, or it's a grant that, you know, is very specific. The main money that we sort of have and that doesn't mean that we don't make decisions about those funds. We do, but those decisions are incredibly circumscribed by either the state statute that governs them or the grant stipulations, right? You can't take grant money for election equipment and give it to the coroner. You can't take fines and fees money from the circuit clerk's office and just take it and give it to, you know, animal control. That's just not right. Or you can't take money from somebody's automation fund and use it for something else. The money that we as a board really have the most sort of power and discretion over is the general fund. And that's only 31% of the money that we receive. Almost everything else we receive has varying degrees of very strident rules upon it. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm probably getting a little dense in my head here. So I think the way I understand it is the previous pie chart, where the source of revenue comes, then is dumped into the buckets on your next chart. Yeah. That's a simple way of understanding it?
Yes. Yes, but it's not like a one-to-one. Do you know what I'm saying?
It's not one-to-one correspondence.
Right.
If you're taking all the money in the pie chart,
right,
wherever it comes from,
right,
the revenue sources gets funneled into these buckets right
right
here. And then some of those buckets, either by law or by process, have to be that way for a targeted revenue income to go into one of those buckets.
Yes.
Okay.
this is a really, really, really important thing to understand and kind of complicated thing to understand about our county. And it's interesting. I really encourage you to look at just type in P-TEL Illinois map, and you will find that our county is somewhat unique in our region for this. Not a lot of counties around us are P-TEL. What P-TEL is a property tax extension limitation law. Sometimes I'll hear people say it's a tax cap. That is not really correct. What it is it caps the growth, okay, that we are able to capture in our property tax assessment. And so it is, and this is important, it is the lesser of either CPI or 5%. So in some years, Tammy just gave me this amazing chart, and I'll pass it around if you want to look at it. For example, in 2008, during the worst part of the Great Recession, the CPI was 0.01%. That means regardless of what we thought, right, as a county, that was like the limiter that we could grow our property tax assessment. Interestingly, and these last 2 years are the first time that this has ever happened, last year it was 7%, or 2021 it was 7%, and in 2022 it was 6.5%. Again, it's capped at 5%. So like for those 2 years, even though CPI was above, so we're always limited by CPI, but in the last 2 years, even though CPI was above 5%, we couldn't capture that growth. And that does impact, and this was something that was decided by referendum in 1996 and was implemented in 1997. And so sometimes when people ask me, why does it seem that every single electronic system in the county is from the 1990s? Why does it seem that every single elected official for the last, from both parties have told me that they're understaffed? Yes, like we have limited ability we do not have the flexibility that, say, the city of Champaign has to say, for example, yes, sheriff, you need 4 more sheriffs, let's just go get them for you, because we are under P-TEL. Yes.
What does CPI stand for?
The Consumer Price Index, sorry. Here, and I'll just pass this around because I think it's interesting.
Just the 2021 levy year is for taxes that we will collect this year. Mm-hmm. And so for the taxes we'll collect next year, right. We'll be able to levy for 5%. Right. Plus, you can also capture new growth revenue when new EAV is added to the tax rolls, which in a year where your CPI is low, that's not likely to be very high either. Yet, we still strive to give fair wages to employees. So in many of those years where CPI was 0.7, 0.8, we were giving 2+% raises. Just a second.
Yes.
The way I understand this then, what you have highlighted here is so for 2022, it's not levied until 2023, so that would be in the 2023. But you don't really get that money until 2024. Is that what that means? You levy it in 23, but your taxes are paid in 2024.
The first column is I don't have it in front of me, but the first column is the tax year. So so for instance, 2021, the levy year was 2022, so we passed this levy at the end of last year for the taxes we'll collect this year. So the assessment year, the levy year, the tax collection year.
So it's 2 years later.
Yes.
Yes.
You used another acronym when you're talking about CPI, EVP, EVS, something like that.
Oh.
Equalized Assessed Valuation, EAV.
Right.
EAV. What is that?
That is the value that property is assessed at.
So it's like the value of all the property in the county, basically. And just to give you a sense of that, I was talking to Mr. Goss. I believe he said that for 2022, or maybe it was 2023, that the EAV is expected to be increased by 11%. I forget now if he was saying 2022 or 23. The EAV moves, it is much more dynamic than the consumer price index.
Yeah.
Right, it's equalizing factor.
Is that a yearly thing or is that?
Yes. Yes.
The reason for that is, I think the reason for that is just so that the taxes are fair across the distribution of the population in the county. I think that's how it works, right? Then you have an equalizing factor of some are not paying enough or some are paying too much, then it kind of balances out or something like that.
Right. Yeah, and that's and the other thing is what PTEL essentially does is it means if a particular set of properties or property in general in the county becomes more valuable, right? If the value of that, if the assessment of that, we can only capture up to 5%. Like, I mean, that's essentially what PTEL does. Okay. All right. Oh, so where does the money go? So a few things I think it's important to know is that there are state shared revenues. So for example, the state pays 88% of our state's attorney salary. It pays some of our assistant, it pays some of our public defender, it pays some of our sheriff, the supervisor of assessment, some of our election judge costs, various probation officers. One that's not on here, but I'm pretty sure that they is part is our highway staff, right?
The highway engineer's salary is paid from motor fuel taxes.
Right. And so all of those, though, in order to get this money, we have to pay these individuals at the rate that the state tells us to, and that's usually based on some formula that has to do with county population. So if we want to get 2/3 of the sheriff's budget, we have to pay the sheriff X. We could pay him less, but then we just don't get any money.
And that's a new thing that was implemented last year for the sheriff. The state basically said you have to pay the sheriff 80% of the state's attorney's salary, and then we'll reimburse 66% of those wages. But when Stephanie referred to personal property replacement taxes earlier, which you'll hear us refer to as PPRT, that's where that funding is coming from. So essentially those PPRT revenues that at one time as a county we were able to receive directly, and the state took that away from us and said, no, we're going to implement this process and then this is the formula we're going to use to distribute these funds back to you. What has happened over the years, and it's now to the level we're over $300 million. They're basically garnishing from those revenues before they're applying the formula. So the sheriff's salary that they're now reimbursing us from is really money that was ours to begin with that they took and then garnished.
So in another word to say is that the state gets all up in our business in terms of, and it is mind-blowing. Like, you know, I remember when I first got on the board, we went over to the old, me and another county board member went over to the old administrator's house for dinner with Tammy and went through the budget for like hours, like 3 hours. And just,
that's not an open invitation.
No, and it was mind-blowing to me, like how many times they're like, oh yeah, you don't get any say in that, the state decides that. I was like, okay, page 7. Yeah, like it's somewhat sometimes kind of frustrating. Okay, so estimated levy by fund for 2023. So this is where within the county funds our property tax levy goes, right? So we have to spell that out in the levy. So 40% of it goes to general corp, and then you could see all the other places where money goes. Expenditure by category, hopefully surprising nobody. If you've been involved in, it's a pretty mix between capital, services, and personnel, and then a little bit of the interfund expenses that Tammy was talking about before. We do have several bonds, so debt service, and commodities, which are things that the difference between do we have is there a financial, is it $5,000 between commodities and capital?
When we capitalize
Yeah.
something, yes, but it's higher for buildings.
Okay.
Than that.
Yeah, a good way to think about this is commodities is stuff you use up, and capital is stuff that's supposed to last, right, for a while. That's a good way to use it. Think about it.
And one of the things, actually, Mr. Wilson, one of your questions earlier made me think about this. If you look at the budget a couple of years ago versus now, this expenditure category for capital is pretty significant compared to what it would have looked like a couple of years ago. And that's because we've got those two major facility projects going on. So, and that's another thing, this has shifted. In a couple of years when those are done, you're going to see this look a little bit different than that.
But the funding part of the capital is really from debt, though, right? It's not out of taxes, it comes out of debt for capital.
In this particular case, yes, the largest portions of that, yes, are coming from the bond issues.
What about the ARPA funds?
Some of the capital expenses that are budgeted are also ARP funds.
ARPA is mostly between, we gave, if you recall, we gave some raises, especially to our 24/7 folks. We gave about $750,000 in one-time bonuses, most of which went to things like we gave across the board money, but then we gave primarily to sheriff's office and animal control, people that had to work 24/7 during the pandemic. Beyond that, now the only ARPA expenditures and personnel are Kathy Larson, and I think maybe somebody from the auditor's office who's helping with some of the reporting. Everything else is either maybe a little bit commodities, but is mostly services and capital. Those are where those funds are, but they're in there somewhere.
I think there's like $7 million for broadband included in that capital. It's in the infrastructure line.
One more question then. This is not capital like CapEx for business and O&M, or is it the same? This is capital because I'm making basically a facility improvement, but I don't get to depreciate my building over years versus this totally different because we're not taxed on our tax, right? This is just a classification, but not in the classical sense of what a CapEx is, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it is, public accounting is a little bit different, right? Yeah, then yes. Oh, before we get off the budget conversation, I did want to bring up one other thing that I probably should have had a slide for earlier on in the budget priorities. Another thing that's really, really important is making sure that we have a robust and healthy fund balance. So our goal, it used to be lower, and I think last year we voted as a board during the budget process to raise our target minimum fund balance at 16.7%, right? So our fund balance is 16.7%. Honestly, if you think about it, that's little over a month, 2 months. Okay, so it's 2 months basically of expenses. There's a lot of reasons why that's important. The first reason that's important is, what if there's an emergency? We just came through COVID. Now, we came through COVID well because there was a lot of federal and state grant money that came in. We actually came out really well, but we didn't know that that was going to happen, and everybody had to tighten their belts. I would argue that what's going on in the jail right now is an emergency, and because we had to close the downtown jail before we were able to open the new jail, right? It was a moral and safety for our staff and for the people there. It had become untenable. Well, in order to do that, we have to house people out of the county. We got to pay for that somehow. We were able to capture some of that through the existing sheriff's budget, but we had to dip into fund balance to do that, right? So the ability to have fund balance is really important. It also impacts our bond rating. And so we, through the hard work of Tammy and the administrative staff, we were able to increase our bond rating to, was it AA1 in this last year. So, and that's probably about, for a county like ours, that's about where we're gonna stay. It's about as high as we really could get, but it was a lot of work. You're not getting, and that impacts what we have to pay on bonds, right? So if you don't have a good bond rating, when you do big project, it costs you more money. Another thing that is really important, you asked about the fiscal year, Ellie. Yes, the fiscal year is calendar, but we don't start getting our property taxes, which is a solid quarter of our budget, until halfway through the year, which means we have to be able to have money, right? Like you have to have the liquidity in order to pay the bills until that money starts rolling in. When I first got on this board, every year our fund balance was so small, we had to borrow money from public safety sales tax in order to pay the bills. And the treasurer would send in an email that would say, okay, I had to take $200,000, would keep the board informed. And then once property taxes started rolling in, we would pay back public safety sales tax. That's, just to be frank, not a good position to be in. It's not a way to run a government, right? But that was when our fund balance was really low, that was the reality that we were under. And
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do we increase the fund balance then?
So a couple of things. I would say one of the biggest things is we had a county nursing home that for a lot of different, the only way that it could have been sustainable was likely to gain additional revenue, which the voters turned down. And so it was impacting a lot of different funds. That was one of the things. Two, just from very, very aggressively tight budgeting, to be honest, like budgeting, especially because of the pandemic, there was so much uncertainty about revenue, like sales tax, like we were like, oh, what's gonna happen to sales? You know what I mean? There was so many different moving parts that we really asked department heads and elected officials to keep it tight, and that helped as well. And then, to be blunt, in part, the ARPA money has taken some of the pressure off. I mean, we are doing projects, elected officials and department heads are getting projects done that we would not have been able to do, right? And that takes some of the tension off of the budget. Is there anything else that you can think of? And also, the state is in a better financial position than it was a few years ago. So one of the things we didn't talk about was that when I first got on the board, the state was swiping, they're constantly swiping money from us, but there were categories where they were even more aggressively swiping from us that they've eased back on a little bit more recently. I would argue that they could ease some more, but that has helped us out. So for a while, the state was even more so sort of balancing their budget on our backs. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, there was a 10% garnishment of our income tax revenues for a period of time, and also garnishment from public safety sales tax revenues as well. But the other thing that we did, and Stephanie referred to it earlier, is that when I first got here, our minimum fund balance was 12.5%, and we actually set the target at 16.7% because we didn't want to be on Moody's radar like, you know, your minimum is 16.7%, but you're way down there. So we set it as a target, and we kind of worked towards that goal and had that mindset. We want to be here. Also, conservative budgeting, just being very conservative in revenue projections to make sure that we weren't, placing those too high. But we have successfully exceeded that minimum 16.7%, and that's not an impressive number. Moody's isn't impressed by that at all. So, through the budget process, the projection for the end of 2022 was 25%. That's a much better position for a county of our size to be in. And so I just, want to reinforce that, through decisions that were made and support of the board, that is what has led us to be in the fund balance position that we are. And we need to try to, hold that if at all possible. Understanding, of course, there's emergencies and we have that there if we need to, but just not letting that get eroded away by increasing operational costs to the point where we can't sustain them and they're just eroding our fund balance.
Right. And that's the balance. I mean, those are the discussions that we really have during the budget process is how do we provide the services we need to provide for the county while also thinking about what is this going to look like 5 years down the road, right? And that is tricky, and I think like sometimes we have really, I'll give the sheriff, the request was for 4 deputies and we ended up giving him 2. And the reason is deputies are remarkably expensive. The training, the outfitting, the cars, the salaries and the benefits. It's not that we don't think that there needs to be 4 deputies, by any sort of math of our county. Yes, in a perfect world we would, but we as a board had a whole conversation about what can we do and still keep the fund balance kind of the way it is, and what do we have right now with public safety sales tax? What will it allow us to do, right? And that, to me, that right there is one of the biggest responsibilities of this board, is trying to figure out where is that balance, right? And I don't know that we always get it right, but we do have have some really good conversations about it and debates during the budget process. I will say, too, though, that we were able to get our bond rating up, get our fund balance up, and we've added 7 more. We added 2 public defenders, 2 deputies, another person. It isn't, and we've been able to make categorically large investments, particularly in our county technology. I'm always hesitant about bonding because I feel like this board is making a decision that will impact boards, 15 years down the road. But we were able to bond at a rate that we are comfortable, right, being able to pay back. However, I think it's also very important to note that despite what went on with the pandemic and stuff, we've benefited from a fairly robust economy. There has been a remarkable lot of high-end property sales in this county. Sales tax has gone very, very well. And there's a new tax called leveling the playing field, which allows us to capture sales tax for online things that previously had been lost, all of which helped us, right? So, I think part of it too is, all of this would look very different if we go into recession. And that's something we have to keep in the back. We were able to build it because we were in a growing economy. If that stops, it will have impact to our fund balance.
So the public defender's office is currently understaffed, and so is the sheriff's office. So if they're fully staffed, how do we sustain that number?
So we budget them as if they were fully staffed. So the budget, what we pass is as if they had their people there, right? Yeah.
When you say they're understaffed, do you mean they have vacancies? Okay.
they would also both argue that they're understaffed in terms of their lines. And I know you've heard from the public defender, and believe me, you'll hear from the sheriff one day during the budget process. And I'm not saying that they aren't, right? But that's a whole nother conversation.
Both of those departments did get, 2 new staff members in the 2022 budget.
I also always tell folks that remember when we approve staff, that is, you don't want to say it forever because we could always later on decide to cut positions, but that is a continuing expense that grows, right? Because the salaries will continue to grow. And so that's always like, I feel like you have to be very aware of that when you add personnel. In a way that commodities, or if somebody wants to buy more file folders or more, needs a set of equipment, yes, there's like maintenance and stuff for that, but personnel is the most lingering of expenses, and that's something to keep in mind. That doesn't mean we say no all the time. We've said yes a lot since I've been on this board. Okay, I literally think I only have like 2 more slides. And then, if there's any questions or if there's anything else, we could always do another one of these if you want to dive deeper into like some of the stuff. You might be like, boy, is this boring. So I just wanted to show you what a budget looked like so you could kind of understand. I think I have 4 more slides, what you're looking at. This is the admin services budget. So when you get the budget, what you'll see is 2020, next year you'll see 2022 actual, 2023 original, what's projected, because they prepare this budget partway through the year, and then what they're asking for the next year. As a rule of thumb, when I get the budget, what I do is I look through it all and I scan down those columns, and if there's a huge difference between 2022 and 23, I circle it and then read the book in more depth to see if there's an explanation. And if not, that's a good question to bring. Like if you see a big change either up or down between 2022 or 23, that's a good place to ask a question, right? When we have those budget hearings in August. So for example, for this, intergovernment revenue is money that we get from Tammy. I always forget which one is which. Which one is the intergovernment?
Postage.
Oh, postage, right? So we have a postage meter, and if for example, who uses it? The townships.
We send out mailings on behalf of the townships for taxes, and then
so they
them.
have to pay us, right? The miscellaneous revenue is, Tammy and I were discussing this, it's from the vending machines. Interfund revenue is we have an insurance specialist, so some of the self-insurance fund goes to pay that person that's an admin, right? So that's all the revenue that admin brings in, right? And then you'll see expenses, and this is you don't need to know what all those little codes mean, but if you want like a cheat, if you look at the third number, each of those little things, like 50101 means elected official salary, 500105 means temporary staff. There's different categories that in our budget system, those numbers mean something. We as board, you don't need to know what those numbers mean. But if you're interested, that third number, if it's a 0, so 500, that 0, that means personnel. If y'all were here on the board, for those who were on the board before, that used to be a 1. So all the numbers have gone up 1. For commodities, things that get used up, and you could see some examples of commodities, categories of commodities: office supplies, books, postage, food, equipment less than $5,000. The third number is 501, so it's a 1. Services are things that we contract out, that the third number is a 2. And this budget doesn't have any capital. But if it did, it would be a 3. And if you're a nerd like me, then if you just want to like shorthand understand what those numbers mean. And then all the trailing numbers mean the specific things, Super.
Just a note for capital for the general fund. The majority of the general fund's capital costs are in the capital asset replacement fund.
Right.
So you won't see capital expenditures in most of the general funds, except for the sheriff has some cars and there's some election equipment.
Right. Yeah, that's a really important thing. When you get the budget, there's the capital asset capital asset replacement fund. It's its own section in the budget. Almost all of our capital expenses are from there. So if you hear somebody say CARF, that's what they mean. So that's another acronym that gets thrown out a lot. After the budget is approved, I lied, there was a couple more slides. Okay, so we approve the budget. That's, in my opinion, the biggest responsibility that we have. But what other kind of financial votes do we do? So we have to vote to approve the annual budget. Any budget amendment when expenses exceed expectations or we need to approve more money when a department receives a grant. One great example of this is when Mike was recorder, we get money for real estate transactions, most of which we pass on to the state, but what do we get to keep, a third of it? Well, there were a lot more, so we budget what we anticipate. We think there's going to be this many real estate, and we budget both the expense that the money we'll get and the money we got to pay out to the state. For the last few years, that has been way more than we anticipated. So we had to vote to say, well, yes, we'll take that money, and yes, we'll pay the state, right? That's just one example. We'll never have to vote on that again, though, because the way the new system allows us to budget, we can just record that as like pass-through, but that's an example. If you get a grant, if you get more money, or if, say, fines and fees, we say that we think we're gonna get this much money, but we get way more. We have to vote to accept that money. If we don't, it's not like we don't get the money, it just goes to general fund. And what that means is then we cannot spend it in 2023. And so sometimes we'll get more money in a certain category, but that department or the county as a whole doesn't need it, so we just let it go to general fund. In fact, a lot of times that's what we do. The only reason we would need to appropriate it is if we think we need to spend it. Does that make sense? Budget transferred when the expenses need to come from a different category than we expected. The only time we have to do this is when we budget things in personnel and we need it for something else, or vice versa. So we, through our great wisdom, write the budget up. We vote on the budget that Tammy and the executive writes up, and then we say, go forth and spend your money. And at the end of the day, if the circuit clerk said that she needed file folders and instead hires a company to file things, that's her business. We don't know it. That's just what she does. She's allowed to move money between commodities and services. However, if she's like, I budgeted a lot of money for filing folders, but instead I want to hire a filing folder person, right? She has to ask us for permission for that because, again, personnel is a forever expense. Not forever, but you know what I mean? So if money moves in or out of personnel, we have to vote on that. If money moves between the other categories, we don't, right? So to give you an example for the ARPA money, another concrete example, we put basically all of the ARPA money, except for a little bit for Kathy Larson, in services and capital. We're doing the broadband project. If we wanted to hire somebody to oversee the broadband project, we would have, as a board, and it was going to be staff at the county, to take a vote on that. If we decide to hire an outside contractor, then we don't have to take a vote on it, right? So that's just that. Now, the only exception is RPC, the Regional Planning Commission. In part, they're so grant funded, and we don't have the same. They have their own board and things too. They're allowed to move money in and out of category personnel without coming to the board. We have to approve contracts or grant agreements or intergovernmental agreements. So Eric's committee for ARPA did all sorts of, we gave a lot of ARPA money away to various water districts. we have to vote on those. If you'll hear IGA, intergovernmental agreement. We added the city of Urbana to our animal control. We had to vote on that, right? You know, we had to vote on the contract for the jail, right? So the board votes on those kind of things. Purchases not following purchase order and authorizing payment of claims. So you've all done these votes. Purchases. Oh, we have a financial policy. I very much encourage you to look at it. We usually revisit it every year. In some cases, because the state will tell us, by the way, or what's the word for it? GAF? The people that oversee
Gap.
Will say, by the way, this should be your practice, then we will reflect that, right, but I'll just pass this around so you could have a sense of it. But I highly recommend that the board is aware of it's a pretty robust document, but is aware. But as you can see, for various reasons, people will use the wrong credit card, not get not get 3 quotes, accidentally pay tax, not have enough money in their budget to cover something. We then have to vote on that. Authorizing payment of claims, that is literally us saying, yep, you could pay the bills, right? That's the money going out any month. That's what that is. Approving actions by the treasurer for properties that have gone to tax sale. We've had a lot of conversation about that one, right? Personnel decisions. So we vote on things like raises, job classifications. We vote on the insurance that our employees get. We vote to approve labor contracts. So all of those kind of things. Usually every year the raises for bargaining unit employees are covered by the labor contracts, but then we also have to decide, are we giving the people a raise? And that's a decision that we have to make during the budget process. Yes?
This is probably on our website, right?
Yes. It is, and if you got one of those nifty packets from Megan, okay, would you mind sending the links to everybody? Okay, that'd be awesome.
I think it was in our binders.
Right. Obviously, we've spent a lot of our time this last year voting on ARPA. Another thing that we might have to decide is we are receiving settlement money from the opioid crisis, and we as a board are going to have to decide how we want to expend that, and we're going to be getting money for 10 years. So that's a conversation that we need to have. So those kind of decisions. Other things like if we go to bond, we have to vote on that. If we retire a bond early, we have to just vote on that. Remember I said before, we took money from public safety sales tax in order to fund operations in years past. In some cases, we had to loan when we had an enterprise fund for the nursing home, we had to loan them money from various funds. The board has to approve those. The executive or whomever can't just go ahead and do it.
At the auditor's office will also bring to the board an interfund loan resolution in April, May. There may have been certain funds, and I know Mr. Wilson had a question about negative fund balances that ended the fiscal year with a negative balance, and so to clean up the books, there is an interfund loan resolution that doesn't really move money from one fund to the other, but it temporarily remedies the negative that may be there for whatever reason, whether it's a grant fund or whether it's a fund that doesn't have a healthy fund balance.
Yeah, sometimes receiving grants don't follow the calendar we would like actually getting the money. Also, sometimes the state giving us certain allocations of money, they might be slow paying us some category of money, right? There was a year, I forget what category of money it was, we were they were actually paying us too fast.
AOIC reimbursement really messes with the county's budget. It's either way delayed or, you know, way too fast, and it's very difficult to budget for that, although they've been pretty good over the last couple of years.
Yes.
Remind me again, what is AOIC?
Association of Illinois Counties. Sorry, I just throw those acronyms out. I don't even think about them not being common language.
So just two examples of and you've all voted on these and they both passed, I think, unanimously. But just to give you a sense of when we have to take some votes, like when things change in the middle of the year. So to kind of like walk you through this one, the auditor's office basically had to do more autopsy and toxicology expenses, right? So you could see it was they needed a little bit of money for equipment, $330. Most of it was professional services. So you see 501, that means it's a commodity. 502, that 2 means it's professional services. So now you could kind of get a sense of what those numbers mean, because otherwise it's just like a bunch of gobbledygook, right? And then, but we do autopsies for counties that aren't ours and they pay us. So they actually got like 90-something $1,000. We took $38,000 to cover those expenses with a little tiny bit of padding. And then the rest, you're like, oh, so what happened to the others, you know, $58,000? That just went to fund balance, right? So it's just revenue that we received that we didn't anticipate, we didn't budget for. He didn't need it, so it's just in fund balance.
One more question then. General fund and fund balance are two different categories.
So yes, so there's the general fund that has a fund balance, but the special revenue funds also have fund balances as well.
Then that means, the way I'm understanding this, 3,500 slides before, just teasing you, but there were different funds, right, and each fund has a fund balance, which is really kind of a rainy day fund contingency bucket that has to stay within that fund.
Correct. And in some cases, and I think the automation fund is probably one of the examples for this, sometimes that department will let that fund build up over the course, in some cases, multiple years, because they have a piece of equipment that they know they're going to need to buy in year 5. In some cases, the funds are very healthy, and some they're not particularly healthy. One of the things is some departments were relying on those automation funds for more operational stuff just because we were budgeting so tight. And one of the things we've been able to do is move some of those expenses onto the general fund so the automation fund can work better. Do you know what I mean? There's certain operational expenses you're allowed to charge to that fund, but in an ideal world you wouldn't. So that's another thing that we've been doing. If you actually look through the budget book, there's usually an explanation of the fund balance for each of the funds. So as you go through it, one of the things you'll see is like, for this fund, you'll notice this fund is really low. That's because of this. We just did a big project out of it. Or you're right, it's a problem. Like the revenue for this fund isn't what it used to be, or, you know, whatever. Or like this is our target, or you might notice that this is super high. Yes, it is. That's because they're saving up money for this, right? Like there'll be an explanation for each of those fund balances. So sometimes you'll see an elected official or department head come and say, I want this money. And then people be like, oh, that's coming from the fund balance. We should say no. You got to look at it really carefully because it might be coming from a special revenue fund balance. And that's what it's for at the end of the day, right? Where I think, and that doesn't mean we don't have to scrutinize it. We certainly do, but not at the same level if it's a general fund balance request, right? Does that make sense? Because like we could say, you know, no, coroner, you cannot buy, I don't know if he has a special revenue fund. Okay, no, coroner, you cannot buy that piece of equipment because we're saving money. He would be like, okay, I guess I'll just ask for it next budget. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like we could use that money to offset the sheriff's expenses. That's, yeah, it's in his little tiny category. And at the top of each budget page, you'll see where that fund is. And general fund is 1080. Everything else is a much more complicated number. Okay. And this, I promise, is the last slide. I had a fantasy that we'd be done in an hour, but you know, I know how that goes. Oh, wait, oops. And so here's another example. The county auditor, I'm sorry, this is, I forget which department this is. Yeah, sorry. Oh, yeah. So the circuit court needed $2,600 is for a full-time employees. Basically, they had somebody retire that had a lot of benefit leave. They needed $2,600, right? And you could see it's 500103. That 500, that's personnel, right? They had no money for that, right? It came from fund balance. Like that, because there wasn't any increase of revenue that was offsetting it. It was just an expense that we budget as, we try to project into the future as much as we can, but sometimes you don't know that, a long-term employee is going to retire or whatever the case may be, right?
General fund in particular, we do not budget for payouts because we would essentially be padding budgets. Some, on occasion, special revenue funds, if we know an employee is leaving, we will go ahead and include that in the budget, but we do not in the general fund.
Let me be clear about why that is, because once we give the elected official the personnel money, they can spend it. And I guarantee you, even if that person didn't retire or say that person got, decided to go on a big, long vacation before they retired, so the payout wasn't as big, you know what I mean, as we anticipated it would be, they'd still spend that money. They'd give somebody a raise, right? Personnel money, by and large, with very few exceptions, gets spent, right? And so we don't want to pay. We want to budget like this is a normal year as much as we can. And then if something happens, we make that decision to go ahead and that's one of the reasons we have the fund balance in order to do that.
Another question.
Yeah.
Previously, you talked about the state swiping money, which I assume there's maybe two categories of swiping. One is they already had a legislation, or they said that by law we're going to take X amount of money. So do they also swipe money for money that's not used that they allocated to be spent in that year? Does that make sense to you?
No.
So
Unless it's a grant.
unless
that-
it's a grant.
No. Yeah. So if they give us money and we don't spend it, no, they don't come back and take it. We're like at the University of Illinois, if you got money in your budget for maintenance or whatever and you don't spend it, you best believe they're taking it. And not only that, then like next year they're going to budget you at whatever, no, that's not the case. Most of it's very formulaic. Okay. Like it's all formulas based on county size or tax percentage or whatever.
So the next question then, the following question is all the different funds, and if, I'm not going to remember all the funds now. The only fund I remember now is general. So all the different funds, then if in a given year that department or that funding category is not used, does that roll over into the next year or does it get swept into the general fund?
If it's a special revenue fund, it would go into that fund balance. If it is a general fund, it would go into the general fund balance. It stays within that fund. But it doesn't just roll over to the next year. The only way it could roll over to the next year to be expended is if we took a vote to do so. The budget dictates what they're allowed to spend. So like if, say for example, and this actually does happen, say somebody thought right now because it's hard to buy things, right? So say somebody was like, I'm going to buy 100 new desk chairs for my department in 2022, and we budget it in 2022, and then desk chairs are on back order. Do you know what I mean? And we can't even get the order in because the desk chair company's like, we're not taking orders right now, and it goes to 2023, right? And that money would fall into fund balance. They'd have to ask us for it back. You know what I mean? Or say it was a special piece of equipment they were going to buy out of their automation fund, and it doesn't occur in 2022. It would fall into, they wouldn't lose the money. It would stay within their automation fund, but they'd have to ask our permission to spend it. This happens a lot in highway because, like I said, highway projects are often very slow rolled.
Right.
For no fault of our highway. That it was the exact same when I was in Indiana. There'd be a project that you'd start in like 2007, and in 2012 they're like, we're groundbreaking. Like, it's just the nature of highway projects, in part because a lot of that is from the Department of Transportation money that comes from the feds, and there's a lot of hoops you have to, it's by far the slowest capital.
It's timing.
The only exception to that would be is if they were aware they weren't going to get the project done or received the product, and they went ahead through the budget process and reappropriated it. So we had that same thing happen with the mobile command center. We actually ordered in 2021, and we had a PO, and then we didn't get it. We reissued the PO in 2022. We didn't get it. We reissued the PO in 2023, and we just got it. But we knew that, so we had budget. We knew we weren't going to get it until 2023, so we budgeted the appropriation again in 2023.
And there's some grants we get every year, so they're in the budget. But then, like, sometimes those grants we don't know we're going to get, or we get more money from a grant than we thought, right? And then they have to come and ask us for permission to both get the money and spend the money. Yeah.
So without breaking any rules, and not talking about what we're not supposed to talk about, can you explain to the newer folks everything about the cannabis money or the dispensary money?
Oh, yeah. So within our sales tax is we get money for cannabis sales tax. We get 3% for everything sold within the cities, which I think is all that we have right now. And if we ever did get a dispensary in unincorporated, we would get 3.75%. We as a board decided on those. There was a range we were allowed, and that's what we decided upon. However, because of the way that state statute is written, there was an interest in using that cannabis money for programs that bring justice to people that have been adversely harmed by the war on drugs, right? However, what we found is that there's a state statute that says unless you are not allowed to discuss how much cannabis sales tax you get, unless you have more than 5 dispensaries within your county, because it's unfair, I guess, because like we'll know their business and how well it's doing. So there was like, I think Sangamon County wasn't even appropriating the money because they were so free. So you're allowed to appropriate it as part of your sales tax, but like Tammy can't tell me this much was done by, we now have 3 in our county, 1 in Champaign and 2 in Urbana. But until we get 6, I am not allowed to, we as a board cannot know how much revenue. That's another, probably it's helping our fund balances, right? Like, it was a decent, before we didn't know we weren't allowed to talk about it. I mean, we were it's some decent money, that sales tax, but we as a board are not allowed to discuss it or know about it because of this state statute. I have asked our various state reps I have asked them to address it, and so far none of them have. Put it that way.
It's not just for cannabis, it's for all sales. So if you have a category of vendors that fall into a particular group, if there's less than 5, then IDOR will not allow us to say what those couple of entities bring in. So it's not just cannabis, it applies to all classifications of sales.
Right. It just impacted cannabis because it's a new sales tax, right? That like came in when it became legal. But like, so people have been like, oh, how much of your budget, you know what I mean, is being impacted? Like, oh, that's why the county's doing better because of the cannabis sales tax. I'm like, maybe. I have no idea, you know what I mean? Yes, our sales tax is performing a lot better than it was. It's not all because of cannabis, though. Just sales tax as a category has been really good the last couple of years. People have been staying home and buying stuff, right? I mean, to be honest with you.
And the level the playing field legislation that Stephanie referred to earlier basically was one of the things the state did that actually helped us. And that essentially imposed sales taxes at the point of delivery. So historically, a lot of that was being, if it was being captured, it was through use tax, which, you know, the compliance for that is so low. But level the playing field legislation, basically everything that is being delivered into Champaign County from out of state is essentially supposed to be being taxed now.
Eric.
Yeah, that's like the Amazon distribution center, right? Everything that you order that comes into the one up there.
Yeah, Amazon was doing that, a lot of that before level the playing field legislation. They were more proactive, but yeah, I mean, Amazon is now 2 of our top 10. I think they're listed twice on our top 10 taxpayers for the county's 1 cent revenues.
Yeah, there's a lot. I really encourage you to spend some time reading the budget book. The beginning has all sorts of like demographic information about the county and who we are as a county. It's fascinating, but just there's paragraphs and paragraphs. Spend some time with it. Like, it's super interesting. One of the things on the sales tax, you could see who the top 10 sales tax pay, like companies, like where we get our money from. And this last year, for the first time, Amazon was on the list. But it also shows why what Tammy was saying before about why having a diverse revenue source is so important. Because say one of those goes away, right? Say one of them is like, I'm not going to be in Champaign County anymore. That would be a big deal, right? So like it's trying to predict how all of this goes is a lot.
And so we did struggle with that before level the playing field legislation, because 60% of our 1 cent tax revenues were made up of 10 taxpayers. So the loss of one of those, you know, could be a significant impact on that one revenue stream.
Well, if you remember when we lost Carl, we had to pay money back. So they should be one of our top 10 taxpayers as far as I'm concerned, but they'll sue me just for saying that. So,
also, you brought up Carl. For those of you that are new to the board, we have an ongoing lawsuit around part of the property taxes with Carl. We've been keeping money aside for that. Basically, we don't have all of the money put aside. Yeah, but it's potential that we'll have more liability out there. So that's something to keep in mind with the general fund. We've discussed this whole thing with Veterans Affairs. That could take a hit to the general fund. There's a lot to keep in mind, right? So like sometimes I feel like people think I'm mean when I'm like, let's slow your roll on. That's a great idea, but like, and they'll be like, we got all this money. And I'm like, yes, but if all these decisions go against us, what is our position going to be in? And that's our job. So I know this was probably like as boring as watching paint dry, but thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I highly recommend that if you have questions that I think sometimes there's this, like we just take votes and everybody acts like we know what's going on. Like ask questions in the budget process. Ask me questions. Jim couldn't be here tonight. Ask Mr. Goff's questions. Like, if you don't understand a vote that you're going to take, I'm going to be honest, I like probably during like the bonding process, I asked so many questions, not just in here, but just like, you know, you could always call me in either party. You all could call me. And if I don't know, I will try to find out. But like, you don't have to come to a meeting uncertain about what the discussion is going to be, like, please, you know, Wayne, God bless him, will call me for like every week for an hour to talk about the you know what I mean? So I'm not saying don't do that, but if you've got questions about something that's on the finance side, please let me know. And finance is not all we do, but it is a major part of what we do. And I always say this, a budget is a moral document. If you want to understand what your values are, I think this is true of a household. I think this is true of a company. I think this is especially true of a public entity. What are your values? Tell me what you spend your money on. How do you spend your money? If we as county board members have an idea about what we want our county to be, if we want to hit those 5 goals that we have, right? Just show me your budget. And that is frankly where we have the most power. We are not elected officials that dictate policy for the most part. So if we want to have an impact on the county, the biggest way that we do is how do we spend our money. So, yeah.
The one thing I would add to that can be a challenge for Champaign County is that so much of what we do, and I know Stephanie referred to this earlier, is mandated by statute. So a lot of our funding basically goes to fulfill those legislative requirements that are mandated by statute, and there's a fraction that's left that you know, is really available for those other priorities.
But I also think it's our moral responsibility to fund the things that we're required to fund in ways that allow our staff to do their jobs successfully, to serve our county successfully, to go home safe to their families successfully. Like that, like, yes, there's things that we are required to do, but you could do those things poorly and, you know, legally, yes, we're doing, you know what I'm saying? Or we could do them well. And a lot of that is driven by how we make budget decisions, right? You know, you could run an election on janky equipment. You could have not enough deputies and not pay them enough. You could, right? You could technically have an animal control, but like, is it a functioning animal control? Is the sheriff's office functioning the way they should? You know, when people call, are we dropping calls because our phone system is so bad, right? And how do we get to the position where the answer to all of those questions is not no? You know what I mean? And I'll just be blunt. When I first got here, a lot of the answers to those questions were no. And not because of any fault. We have amazing staff that does an amazing work. In my opinion, for a very long time, this county wasn't giving them the tools they needed to do their jobs properly. And we've made some headway on that, but there's a lot that's still, like, just to give you the one thing that keeps me up at night is we have a court, what is that? What is JNO called? What is that system called? Case management system that is from some other century. For us to update that is $10 to $15 million. That is not budgeted, right? That's just out there. And I mean, it's a bad system. We've cleaned up a lot of some of the other systems. That one is still out there. And so, like, if you come and you're like, I've got this great idea, just remember in the back of my mind, I'm like, yeah, but at some point we need a court case management system that is, from the 21st century. And on that super positive note, but I will say this, we are in a much better financial position than we were when I first got on this board. A lot of it is because of the hard work of the staff and the elected officials to get us there. But I also think it's, to some degree, some credit of the board. We've debated and made, I think, good decisions to put us in this position. That we are better off than we were, but we could still be better.
I just want to add to that because I don't think there were new board members on when I had made the comment about going through COVID. that financial forecast that I had to put together was the hardest thing I have ever done. Economists were all over the board, and I basically came and said to the board, I don't know, I don't have a crystal ball, but my recommendation was essentially to cut every revenue line that I felt would be impacted by COVID, and we did, and the board supported that. The board could have said, nah, we're not going to do that. But you know, we did, and we came out better than, you know, what was projected. And then we basically broke even that year, and we had all of that grant money the state and feds gave us that just got to go to our fund balance, because we were so proactive in terms of making sure we didn't overestimate our revenues. And on the flip side of that, went to elected officials and department heads and said, freeze hiring. It wasn't anything formal, but it was freeze hiring. Don't hire unless you really need to. Please don't, you know, spend your whole budget. Only buy what you need. So, you know, proactive on both revenue and expenditure side is part of what brought us through that. And that was the board supporting the elected officials, administration, and department heads, giving us the tools to, you know, prepare the budget in the way that we felt was best.
Thank you.
The
so
end.
much.
Do I have to like adjourn?
You just did.
Okay. The presentation.